Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep into Syria.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you guys have sent in some really fascinating stuff about what's been happening over there,
Yeah.
especially with Assad's recent downfall.
Yeah.
And we're going to be looking at some excerpts from a podcast called The Rest is Classified.
Okay.
It's hosted by David McCloskey. He's a former CIA analyst.
I see.
So that should give us a pretty clear picture of what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah. It's certainly a pivotal moment, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
I mean, the Assad dynasty, it held Syria for over half a century.
It's incredible, right?
And now it's finally crumbled.
Gone.
Yeah. And what's really fascinating to me is how this seemingly unbreakable regime, they were known for their iron fist,
Right.
how it ultimately collapsed.
Yeah, that's what I found so interesting, too. McCloskey was actually stationed in Damascus before the Civil War broke out.
Oh, wow.
And he describes this atmosphere of just intense surveillance. Like, everywhere you go, you're being watched.
Oh, I bet.
He even jokes about, being followed by government agents in these ill-fitting suits and white gym socks.
Really?
Yeah, it honestly sounds kind of comical when you read it.
It does paint a rather absurd picture, but beneath that facade, you have to remember there was this truly ruthless security apparatus.
Oh, absolutely.
Assad's power structure was meticulously designed to maintain control.
Through fear.
Exactly, fear and intimidation.
Right.
And it's interesting, rather than a single centralized intelligence service like you might see in other countries,
Yeah.
he fostered this intense competition between multiple security branches.
So they're all spying on each other as well as the population.
That's right.
That seems everyone's suspicious of everyone else.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a very stable foundation.
No, not at all.
I mean, that's got to create paranoia and distrust.
Precisely. And this complex web of security forces all vying for power and influence.
Right.
It ultimately made the regime brittle, prone to collapse.
Like a house of cards. Exactly like a house of cards. You remove a few key elements and the whole structure comes tumbling down.
And then the Civil War in 2011, that was it.
Yeah.
That's what pulled out those cards.
It forced Assad to rely increasingly on outside forces, like Iran and Russia.
And that's
which, as we've seen,
another can of worms.
It can have some serious drawbacks.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
To maintain his grip on power, Assad had to make concessions,
Right.
allowed the proliferation of militias, and turned a blind eye to war profiteering.
It's a slippery slope.
It really is. It was a Faustian bargain that ultimately eroded the state from within.
So it's like the snowball effect.
Yeah.
One compromise leads to another, and pretty soon you've lost control of your own country.
Right.
That's terrifying.
It is. And one of the most startling examples of this, I think, is the Captagon trade.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Which has become a major source of income for Syria.
But it's not really controlled by the government, is it?
Well, a lot of it's controlled by these militias that are essentially operating as independent entities.
So they're making money, they're getting powerful.
Right.
And Assad just has to kind of sit there and watch.
It highlights a crucial point, I think. The regime was already losing its grip well before its final collapse.
Yeah.
The Syrian army, which was once this symbol of the regime's strength, it became riddled with corruption. They lacked morale.
They weren't really a fighting force anymore.
They were a paper tiger.
A paper tiger, exactly.
And then in November 2024,
Yeah.
this coalition of opposition groups, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS,
Right.
they launched their offensive. And what happened next was truly remarkable.
It was incredible.
The supposedly invincible regime crumbled with astonishing speed.
It really did.
It reminds me of the fall of Kabul in 2021,
Oh, yeah.
when the Afghan army, which had been backed by the West for years, collapsed practically overnight.
It's almost like they were just waiting for someone to give them permission to surrender.
The parallels are striking.
Yeah, totally.
Both regimes projected this image of strength, but they were ultimately hollow shells.
Just waiting to be cracked open.
And this raises a critical question, I think.
Okay.
What are the implications of this power vacuum in such a strategically vital region?
Yeah.
And perhaps even more importantly for you,
Okay.
what does the rise of HTS, a group with roots in jihadism, mean for the future of Syria?
That's what I find so fascinating about this whole thing,
Yeah.
It's fascinating and unsettling.
I agree.
Because they've been governing Idlib province for several years now.
Right.
And there are these conflicting reports about their rule.
Oh, interesting.
On one hand, they've established what seems to be a functioning government.
Okay.
But on the other hand, their ideology is really concerning.
It is. It's a complex and nuanced situation.
Yeah, I mean, can we trust them when they say they're inclusive and moderate, or are they just wolves in sheep's clothing?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
That intelligence agencies all over the world are grappling with.
Trying to figure this out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we need to unpack this HTS enigma a little bit.
Okay.
Their leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jilani,
Right.
he has a past that's both intriguing and worrisome.
Yeah, I've heard a little about him.
He fought against the U.S. in Iraq.
Really?
He was imprisoned at Abu Ghraib,
Wow.
and he even led al-Qaeda's Syrian branch for a time.
That's quite a resume.
It is, yeah.
It makes you wonder,
It does.
what's he really about?
It really does.
What are his true motivations?
Yeah, like, is he a pragmatist? Is he a chameleon?
Right, or maybe a little both.
Yeah,
I mean, his actions in Idlib offer some clues.
Okay.
They've established what they call the Syrian Salvation Government,
Right.
which seems to be operating with at least some degree of pragmatism and even, technocratic efficiency.
That sounds almost contradictory to their image as a jihadist group.
Exactly.
It's a strange mix.
It is, but there's a darker side to the story, too.
Oh, okay.
Minority groups are excluded from their political structures.
So not so inclusive after all. Not really.
Yeah.
And there's a very distinct lack of respect for popular sovereignty.
That's a problem.
It is.
So it's a mixed bag.
It really is a mixed bag.
So is Jelani a reformed jihadist?
It's hard to say.
Or is this just a more palatable facade
Right.
for this same old extremism?
That's the question we need to explore further, I think.
Yeah, and
It's not going to be easy.
No, it's not.
But the answer will have a profound impact on Syria's future.
Absolutely, and not just Syria's future, but the entire region's and potentially even the global fight against terrorism.
That's right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
the rise of HTS really highlights a recurring theme in the Middle East, doesn't it?
It does. What's that?
The unintended consequences of foreign intervention. Like, look at the U.S. involvement in Iraq.
Yeah,
Arguably, that created the conditions for ISIS to rise.
that's true.
And now we have the Syrian civil war, fueled in part by Russian and Iranian intervention.
Right.
And that's given rise to HTS. It's a pattern we've seen before.
Yeah, and it's a sobering reminder that, intervening in these complex geopolitical situations can often backfire.
Yeah.
You can end up creating new threats and destabilizing the region even further.
There's like a hydra, isn't it?
Exactly.
You cut off one head and two more grow back.
So as we move on to part 2 of this deep dive, the question on everyone's mind is, what's next for Syria?
Right.
Is there any hope for peace and stability under HTS?
It's hard to say.
Is Jelani the reformer he claims to be?
We need to look at the evidence.
Or is this just a new face for an old threat?
That's what we'll explore in part 2.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So picking up where we left off last time, let's
Yeah.
try to make sense of what Syria's future might look like with HTS at the helm.
Yeah.
It's a dramatic shift, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And the implications, they're massive.
They're far-reaching.
Yeah, and the whole thing is just full of contradictions.
It really is.
HTS came to power promising stability and a break from Assad.
Right.
But they've got this history steeped in violence.
Yeah. And their
They
ideology
had a deeply conservative ideology that, frankly, makes a lot of people nervous.
It does. And there's this immediate tension between their desire for legitimacy on the world stage.
Right. They want to be seen as the good guys,
Exactly. And their actions on the ground.
which haven't always been so good.
So can they govern effectively?
That's the big question.
Can they provide basic services?
Rebuild the country.
Right. Rebuild shattered infrastructure.
Yeah.
Address the humanitarian crisis.
It's been going on for years.
Years. And these are monumental challenges for any government.
Let alone one with HTS's baggage.
Exactly.
It's like they're walking a tightrope.
They are.
They need to convince the international community that they're a viable governing force.
Right.
That they can bring peace and stability to this war-torn nation.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time,
They have to keep their base happy.
exactly, they've got this deeply conservative base that expects them to implement their very strict interpretation of Islamic law.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Very delicate.
And let's not forget the potential for internal divisions within the opposition.
Oh, right.
HTS might have led the charge against Assad.
They weren't the only ones.
No, they weren't alone.
There were all these different factions involved,
Right.
each with their own agenda and ideology.
So can they work together?
That's a good question.
Can they create a unified Syria?
Or Are we going to
Absolutely
see?
descend into infighting.
Yeah, more chaos like we've seen in other countries after conflicts.
Exactly.
That's a worrying thought.
It is.
Yeah.
And then you have to factor in the presence of external actors
Oh, yeah.
who have their own interests in Syria.
Like Russia.
Russia, exactly.
They still have a pretty big military presence there.
They do.
They might have abandoned Assad.
But they're not going to just walk away.
No, they've invested too much.
They've got strategic interests in the region.
Right, they want to maintain that influence.
Exactly. And their calculus has probably shifted now.
How so?
Well, it's about damage control,
Okay.
salvaging what they can from a lost investment,
So they'll try to negotiate with HTS
most likely,
to try and hold on to what they've got,
to their naval base
Mhm.
at Tartus,
right?
their air base,
Mm-hmm.
which is crucial for supplying their operations in Africa.
But will HTS play ball?
That's the big question,
Us
isn't it?
is, who knows what they're thinking?
And then you have Iran,
Right.
another major player.
Good time.
They've poured resources into supporting Assad,
Mm-hmm.
and they've got their own network of proxy militias operating inside Syria.
So it's a very tangled web.
It is. It's
Wow.
incredibly fluid. The geopolitical chessboard is being rearranged as we speak.
And we're just trying to keep up?
Exactly. It's hard to predict what the final outcome will be.
Yeah, but we can at least try to analyze some potential scenarios.
We can. One possibility is that HTS recognizes the need for international legitimacy
Okay.
and aid.
They're going to need help to rebuild the country.
Yeah, exactly. And they attempt to moderate their stance.
So like a rebranding
Kind of.
from jihadist group to something a little more palatable.
Right. More internationally acceptable.
But can they really pull that off?
Well, they could focus on providing basic services, rebuilding infrastructure.
Showing that they can govern. Yeah.
Exactly. And showcasing a commitment to inclusive governance.
At least on the surface,
Right. And this could potentially attract international aid
which they desperately need.
and recognition, which is crucial for Syria's recovery.
But that would require a genuine shift in their ideology and behavior.
It would.
Can they really shed that extremist past?
There's a lot of skepticism about their true intentions.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be the first time a group has rebranded itself for political expediency,
Exactly. Their actions will speak louder than words.
and the world will be watching.
Oh, absolutely. The international community will be watching them very closely.
They've got a lot to prove,
They do. And there are reasons for skepticism.
given their history,
Their history and the deep-rooted distrust they face,
especially among minority groups.
especially among minority groups within Syria.
Yeah, so it's not going to be easy for them.
No, it's not. And let's not forget about potential spoilers.
Oh, all right.
Other factions within the opposition.
Who want power for themselves.
Exactly. Vying for power. And they could easily exploit any misstep by HTS.
Leading to more conflict.
Renewed conflict and instability.
So it's like Syria's future is hanging in the balance.
It really is. It's a volatile situation full of uncertainty.
Yeah. And another scenario we have to consider is that HTS consolidates its power,
Okay.
but maintains its hardline stance.
So no rebranding.
No, they double down on their ideology.
They could establish a theocratic regime
Like Iran.
similar to Iran with limited individual freedoms and a focus on implementing their strict interpretation of Islamic law.
Which would be a nightmare for a lot of Syrians.
It would, particularly those who don't adhere to their ideology.
Yeah, you could see a mass exodus of refugees.
Absolutely, further exacerbating the humanitarian crisis.
And it would probably lead to increased regional tensions.
Most likely, countries like Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia.
They all see HTS as a threat,
They do, a direct threat.
and they could easily get drawn into the conflict.
It could escalate into a larger regional war.
That's a scary thought.
It underscores how complex this situation is.
It's not a simple good versus evil narrative.
No, it's not.
There are so many layers of conflict.
Competing interests.
The potential for unintended consequences.
Always.
It's like a minefield,
It is. And what's striking is that Assad's fall.
which seemed like such a turning point.
Right.
It might not actually bring about the peace and stability that so many Syrians have been hoping for.
It might usher in a new era of turmoil and uncertainty.
So in a way, it's a lose-lose situation.
It could be.
Either way, the Syrian people face a really difficult path ahead.
They do.
But what about the international community?
Right. What role can they play in all of this?
Will they engage with HTS?
Even if it's reluctantly.
Yeah, just to try and stabilize things.
To prevent further humanitarian suffering.
Or will they isolate them?
Sanction them. push them further into extremism.
Making a negotiated solution even more difficult.
It's a tough dilemma.
It
I
is.
mean, engaging with
It
this,
could be seen as legitimizing them,
right, giving them a platform to spread their ideologies.
which nobody wants.
But complete isolation could backfire,
Driving them underground,
making it harder to track their activities.
especially regarding terrorism.
Exactly.
So the West faces a difficult choice.
A very difficult choice. And the consequences of either option are really uncertain.
It's a tough one.
It is. And through all of this,
We can't forget about the Syrian people.
no, we can't.
They've endured years of conflict and displacement.
Their voices need to be heard.
Absolutely. Any solution to this crisis has to prioritize their needs.
And their aspirations.
Right. It has to be about them.
And this brings us to another critical point.
Okay.
The need for a comprehensive political solution.
That actually addresses the root causes of the conflict.
Exactly. It's not enough to simply remove Assad from power.
Right. There were problems long before him.
There needs to be a genuine effort to address the issues of political representation,
Okay.
sectarian divisions,
Right.
economic inequality.
These things have plagued Syria for decades.
They have. So it's about more than just a change in leadership.
It's a systemic problem.
It is. It's about addressing the deep-seated grievances that fueled the conflict in the first place.
So a complete overhaul of the system.
It's a complex and multifaceted challenge.
And there are no easy answers.
No, there aren't. But the first step is acknowledging the need for a political process.
That includes all segments of Syrian society.
Exactly. Everyone needs to have a seat at the table.
And that means finding a way to bring all parties to the table.
Yes.
Even those who may have been complicit in the regime's atrocities.
It's a difficult but necessary step towards reconciliation and lasting peace.
Yeah, if you don't address the past,
If you don't find a way to move forward together,
the cycle of violence and instability is just going to continue.
most likely it will. And this brings us to another layer of complexity,
Okay.
the issue of justice and accountability.
Right. What happens to those who are responsible for all the crimes that were committed during the conflict?
It's unavoidable, that question.
It is. The Assad regime was notoriously brutal,
It was.
and many Syrians are demanding justice.
They are.
So will there be trials?
Tribunals?
Or will the focus be solely on moving forward and rebuilding?
Even if it means letting those responsible for atrocities go unpunished.
That's a tough one.
It's a highly sensitive and contentious issue.
It is. Some people argue that pursuing justice could actually hinder reconciliation.
And prolong the conflict.
But others believe that impunity will only breed more violence and resentment,
It's a complex moral and political dilemma.
with no easy answers.
No easy answers,
Yeah.
but it's a question that can't be ignored.
Absolutely not.
And it highlights the long and arduous path ahead for Syria.
It's not going to be easy.
No, the fall of Assad is just the beginning of a new chapter.
Right, one that's filled with both challenges and opportunities.
Exactly.
So looking ahead, what are some of the key factors that will shape Syria's future?
Well, first and foremost, the ability of HTS to consolidate its power
Right.
and establish a stable government.
Can they actually govern?
That's the question. Their actions in the coming months and years will determine whether they can transform themselves
From a militant group?
into a responsible governing force.
Big transformation.
It is.
And what about the role of the international community?
Right. Will they be willing to engage with HTS?
To support Syria's reconstruction?
Or will they remain wary and skeptical?
Potentially hindering the country's recovery.
It's possible their stance will be critical, their willingness to provide aid, diplomatic recognition,
Support for a political solution?
all of that will be essential, but they'll also be cautious.
Given HTS's past.
And the potential for instability.
There's a lot of distrust to overcome.
There is.
And then there's the issue of regional dynamics.
Right. Will neighboring countries like Turkey, Iran, Israel,
Will they accept a new power dynamic in Syria?
or will they try to influence events to their advantage?
It's a very complex geopolitical landscape.
Incredibly complex. These countries have their own security concerns,
Strategic interests.
and their actions could either contribute to stability.
Or make things even worse.
It's a very delicate regional balance.
So it sounds like a very uncertain future for Syria,
It is indeed. And it's a reminder that revolutions,
which are often sparked by this hope for a better future.
right,
They can also lead to unexpected and challenging outcomes.
they can. The road ahead for Syria will be long and difficult.
And the ultimate outcome.
It remains to be seen.
So in this part of our deep dive, we've explored some potential scenarios for Syria's future,
We have.
the challenges and opportunities ahead,
Right.
and the key factors that will shape the country's destiny.
We've also highlighted the complexities of navigating a post-conflict environment
That delicate balance between justice and reconciliation.
and the importance of considering the voices and needs of the Syrian people.
Right, this is about them.
It's a complex tapestry of issues, all intertwined.
Yeah. And now, in the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we'll shift our focus to the global implications of Assad's fall.
Sounds good.
What does it mean for the balance of power in the Middle East?
Right.
What are the potential repercussions for the fight against terrorism?
We'll examine those questions and more in the final part of our deep dive into the fall of Assad.
So we've spent a lot of time, really unpacking those internal complexities of what's happening in Syria,
Yeah.
that power vacuum, the rise of HTS, the potential for more conflict. But now I'm really curious to kind of shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and get your perspective on how Assad's fall is sort of reverberating on the global stage.
Well, it's definitely a seismic event, no question,
Right.
sending shockwaves through the global power structure.
It's got to be a major blow to Iran and Russia, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, they were Assad's longtime allies.
They poured significant resources into propping up his regime.
And now all that investment's just gone.
Evaporated.
It's a hit to their prestige, for sure, but it's also a strategic loss.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about Russia's naval base at Tartus.
Right. Their only Mediterranean foothold.
Exactly. And then the air base that they use to supply their operations in Africa.
All of that is now in jeopardy.
So what happens now? I mean, do they just pack up and leave?
Well, they'll likely try to negotiate with the new power structure in Syria, whoever that ends up being, to maintain access.
Right.
But their bargaining position is significantly weaker.
Yeah, they don't have a lot of leverage anymore.
Not as much.
And this brings up a point that I think is really intriguing, with the U.S. seemingly, disengaging from Syria.
Right.
Is this an opportunity for other powers to kind of step in and fill that void?
Absolutely. Power abhors a vacuum,
As they say.
as they say. And I think a country like Turkey, which is already deeply involved in the Syrian conflict,
Right.
could use this as an opportunity to expand their influence,
Especially in the north.
especially in the north, where they already have a presence.
And what about the Kurds?
Ah, yes, the Kurds.
They control a big chunk of northeastern Syria.
They do.
And they've been valuable allies to the U.S. in the fight against ISIS.
Right.
But if the U.S. pulls out, I mean, their future seems pretty uncertain.
Oh, it does. They're in a very difficult position.
Yeah, what are their options?
Well, they're going to need to reevaluate their alliances,
Okay.
perhaps seek some kind of accommodation with the new regime in Damascus.
Possibly even with Russia.
Even with Russia, it's possible their fate is uncertain, and it has significant implications for regional stability.
Yeah, for sure. And this brings us to another critical concern, terrorism.
Right.
I mean, HTS has this history rooted in jihadism.
It does.
And even though they've tried to present this more moderate image, there's
Mhm.
still a lot of unanswered questions about what they really want.
Their true intentions.
Exactly. And a destabilized Syria with a weak central government and all these different factions fighting for power.
Right.
I mean, that's just a breeding ground for extremist groups.
It is. It's fertile ground for groups like ISIS to regroup and regain strength.
And we've already seen reports of ISIS cells operating in central Syria
They could easily exploit the current chaos,
to launch attacks.
potentially targeting Western interests.
So the West has to be paying attention to this.
They're undoubtedly aware of this threat.
And they're going to need to reassess their counterterrorism strategy.
Absolutely. This could involve increased intelligence sharing,
Yeah.
military support for regional partners.
And maybe even direct action against these terrorist groups.
It's possible. It's a sobering reminder that the fight against terrorism is far from over.
It's not going away anytime soon.
No. And Assad's fall has just added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
It has been.
It's given us so much to think about.
We've explored the internal dynamics of the country.
The regional power struggles, the global implications.
It's a multidimensional situation.
With no easy answers.
No easy answers at all.
So what stood out to you most during this deep dive? Was it the speed of the regime's collapse?
That was pretty remarkable.
The rise of HTS?
A bit unsettling.
Or the potential for Syria to become this battleground for all these competing global powers?
For me, it's the realization that we're witnessing a really profound shift in the regional order.
Yeah.
The old rules don't apply anymore.
Things have changed.
The future is uncertain and the stakes are incredibly high.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive into the fall of Assad, one question kind of keeps coming back to me. What does this all mean for the future of, democracy and authoritarianism globally?
Right.
Is this a sign of a shifting world order or just a ripple in this larger wave of change?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is. It's something for all of us to think about and remember. Keep exploring, keep asking questions. That's what makes the world such a fascinating and sometimes unnerving
I
place.
agree.